Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T. You know, it depends on how you count things, but by one pretty good metric, which is the New Books Network's numbering system, this is the 100th episode of Peoples and Things, which is about twice as many episodes as I originally set out to make. Wow. Woohoo! What does one say at a moment like this? Well, first of all, I want to thank my friends, producer Joe Fort and production assistant Mandy Lamb, without whom this show would simply not exist. I also want to thank you, the listeners of this program, who make it worth doing. We've got a great show for you on this just monumental occasion. The book in today's episode is called Spy Plane: Inside Baltimore's Surveillance Experiment by Ben Snyder, Associate Professor of Sociology at Williams College. Spy Plane, which as the title suggests, recounts the story of a surveillance system used for a time in Baltimore, Maryland, is one of those great books that really surprised me. It simply wasn't on my radar, and I actually heard about it from a publicist. Once I got into the book, though, I found a work that was both well-written and marvelously researched. I especially loved how Ben wrote about the different groups involved, from the company that ran the spy plane to the community members affected by it, and he wrote about it with such sensitivity and compassion. This sensitivity and compassion led him to write a tale full of interesting ironies and delicious little nuances. For example, even though community members were bothered by some parts of the surveillance program, understandably, they also had mixed feelings about its eventual discontinuation. I had a wonderful time talking with Ben about this book, which really caught me off guard. I hope you enjoy our conversation, folks. Hey, get excited! Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Lee. It's so great to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I feel honored to actually be on.
Thank you. So Spy Plane is a cool book. If you're telling kind of like non-academic strangers about it, what do you say it's about? What were you trying to do with it?
Yeah, on one level, it's just a wild story. It's kind of a stranger than fiction story.
Yeah.
That is about this military grade aerial surveillance technology that in Baltimore was called the spy plane. That's what citizens in Baltimore ended up calling it. That's not its technical name. Its technical name is called wide area motion imagery, which sounds pretty benign. But this technology was given to the Baltimore Police Department through a contract with a company called Persistent Surveillance Systems. And the technology ostensibly says it can track every citizen in public view for hours at a time. And in the hands of police is supposed to help detectives especially solve, quote unquote, solve otherwise unsolvable crimes, which was kind of the tagline that Persistent Surveillance Systems added to the technology. And so the book kind of walks you through this experimental use of this military grade technology. And, I drop you right inside the operations center of the spy plane and through direct observation, show you how police use the technology to work murders, shootings, various forms of violent crime, crime cases in Baltimore.
The access is incredible. I mean, this is just it's a wild thing that the company was so open. I mean, this appears to be one of their values was, transparency in quotation marks.
Yeah, it surprised me too. And I mean, you sort of have to hand it to the CEO of the company, whose name is Ross McNutt. And McNutt is an ex-military guy who went into private business with this technology that he partly helped develop for the military. And I had heard about it on a podcast, actually, on the podcast Radio Lab, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. And it intrigued me. I called up Ross McNutt directly and said, "Hey, would you mind talking to me?" He was very open. And the thing that he said to me all these years that I've been studying his company and the technology is, we believe in total transparency, which is not something you typically see with a tech CEO.
No, right.
Yeah, so he's unusual, and I'm very thankful to him, actually, that he did open the door so widely. But more or less, I was the one to ask. And when it came time for the spy plane to be deployed in Baltimore in 2020, I asked if I could come see behind the scenes, and he said yes. So there I was.
Yeah, it's amazing. And what do you think drives his belief in transparency? Is it that it was a public technology going to be used in a public way, so it needed to be open? Like what do you think was driving that?
I mean, my read of Ross McNutt is that he is what we in STS sometimes call a techno solutionist. He's the type of person who believes in the kind of utopian possibilities of technology. And for him, he sees nothing but a good side here. We have this technology that can track criminals. It can do it better than police can, and it can do it for cheaper, actually. We don't have to hire a bunch more detectives. So why wouldn't you want this? And I think people have a lot of fears around a technology like this. It sounds Orwellian.
Yeah.
And I think partly he saw my study as a way to just sort of show people how it really works so that they won't be afraid anymore. And we'll see that it has the possibility to solve this very, very difficult problem of violent crime in Baltimore.
So, the other thing, I mean, you kind of mentioned it in passing, but you started this like right in the heart of COVID days, right? I mean, so what was that like? I mean, you kind of open with that in your book. It's just like, yeah, I mean, a lot of uncertainty. You weren't sure if you should even do this. I mean, yeah, just kind of tell us about what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm sure a lot of your listeners are academics, so they'll resonate with this. I was pre-tenure, and this was the project that was going to get me tenure. And so I had worked for years to gain the access that I did. And then the announcement was made in December of 2019 that Baltimore was going to deploy the planes on a massive scale, a scale that had never been done before. And here I was with access to that. And then a few months later, the first, announcements, public announcements and worries about COVID hit. So it turned into this question really between me and my family about whether I should go do the research at all. And we hemmed and hawed about it and went back and forth. And we ultimately decided as a group, my family, including my extended family who live in Baltimore, that I should go ahead and do it. But it was, it felt incredibly dangerous. I don't know how exactly dangerous it was, but you can remember, March, April, May 2020. Yeah, I mean, so while everybody was on lockdown, I was driving on an empty I-95 down to Baltimore to do the research. Yeah. So it was crazy.
You consider this, describe this as your main method is like participant observer research and see yourself, continuing that tradition. And one of the things, really nice things, first of all, I just want to say, this is a wonderfully written book. I think,
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean,
it makes me feel good.
I just bump into books every once in a while, like Julia Tacona's Left to Our Own Devices is one of my favorite kind of well-written books. And yours is up there with just being really nicely written. You just shoot straight. And so like you had this sentence where you said, doing kind of participant observer research, allowed you to see, as you put it, contradictions between what I observed or heard people say and what I saw in the raw footage. And you said this kind of tension could be incredibly revealing. So, I mean, one of the other things I like about your book is that even though I think you have real questions about this technology, you are very sympathetic to, Ross and the other people. But you do see these
Yeah.
tensions. So, I mean, how did that work for you as a researcher and writer? Like, if you see a kind of tension arise between what you're observing with your own eyeballs and kind of what you're hearing, like, how do you deal with that?
I mean, to me, this is why I am an ethnographer and why participant observation is the key method for me. I also do a lot of interview based research, but for me, an interview is always a retrospective account of what is ostensibly a live moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you can get both takes, both what you see live as well as people's perceptions of it,
Yeah.
to me, you're getting like a much more broad spectrum view of what's going on. And in this case, that was particularly interesting because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the spy plane footage is really hard to see. It's hard to interpret. It's quite pixelated and weird. And so when an analyst sees the imagery and makes a conclusion, I don't just have to take that at face value. I can go back because I had the access to go look at the raw footage and see for myself, well, how are they coming up with that set of claims about who is innocent, who's guilty, these sorts of conclusions that end up coming out.
Yeah. Again, just incredible access that they were even allowed you to like go back and you wasn't just like, you were able to like go back and look with your own eyeballs. It's just an incredible access is so important for telling these stories. Before we kind of move
Yeah.
on with the book, I wanted to mention you have an earlier book called The Disrupted Workplace, Time and Moral Order of Flexible Capitalism. Could you just tell people a bit about that book and the connections you've seen between? Because I kind of was thinking about your work in the last couple of days, and I think there's kind of a line to be drawn like through your projects. So yeah,
Yeah, I'm glad you see it. I don't think I do all the time, to be honest. But
that's typical.
I mean, I sometimes I feel like I'm just kind of following the muse. It's like, what story do I feel like telling now?
Yeah,
But I do. Yeah, there is a connection, and the connection is I think quite a lot about the way digital technologies mediate our relationship to experiences. I think that's really interesting to me. And I'm particularly interested in like visceral experiences. So in my earlier book, one of the things I did was ride around with truck drivers. So that was like a
cool.
big part of the book. So I got to sort of see how the truck driving industry works. It turns out they're surrounded by technologies, surveillance technologies as well.
Yeah,
And a lot of those technologies kind of mediate their relationship to what is otherwise a very material, concrete, working class job. So I was quite fascinated by that. I don't think we usually think of truck drivers as a kind of high tech job, but it really is.
Yeah. Them and
it's very,
yeah.
and it's a very skilled job. It's a very
Totally.
highly skilled job, very difficult work to do. So I think out of that field work, I got very interested in how technologies mediate our relationship to these visceral experiences. So I got to start thinking about other things like that. And I thought a lot about violence, actually. And, these surveillance analysts, what they're doing every day is looking at people shooting and harming each other.
Jesus.
But it's through this weird mediation, this weird pixelated view. And I
Yeah.
was quite fascinated by that just basic situation. And I wanted to know more about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, can you talk a bit about kind of building on the violence theme? One of the things you kind of touched on this a bit when you talked about McNutt, but you write it that these spy planes originally came out of the battlefields of Iraq. So can we talk about the kind of military spillover side of this and how
Yeah.
this transitions and what that looked like?
Yeah. Folks will probably know, but there is a huge transfer of technology, ideas, tactics, organizational structures from the military to the police. It's a long-standing tradition that goes back to the roots of policing in America. So this is not unusual that this happens, but the way it worked in this case is the technology that came to be called the spy plane was developed around 2004 during Lee. You'll remember this. Do you remember the troop surge?
Oh yeah, no, that war was
Yeah,
really important for my identity. So yep, I do remember
me
that well.
too.
Yeah,
I think we share that. Yeah. So the troop surge of the Iraq War, was this time when the perception was we're kind of losing the fight, and a big problem in that war was roadside bombers. You'll probably remember this from those days. So McNutt and a number of other military folks were tasked with trying to figure out how to deploy a new technology that could solve the roadside bomber problem.
I got it.
And this is what they came up with. So the idea is if you can have a camera in the sky that's always filming this very gigantic patch of Earth, then you can always have footage of where the roadside bomber ended up. So the way they used it was the bomb would explode. They could then track backward in time from the explosion anyone who came in and out of that scene, and eventually find the base of operations of the roadside bomber operation, and then, go and quote unquote neutralize the threat, as they would say in the military. So
fascinating.
That was the roots of the idea.
That's really interesting. There's also in the introduction and in other places in the book, you kind of nicely play with what you call boomer/doomer hype. I thought that was a great way of kind of languaging these things some of us have been talking about for a while. But can you say, talk about how kind of boomer/doomer hype what you call boomer/doomer hype cycles kind of play into public debate about these very kind of public facing technologies as you saw?
Yeah. So I know you had Emily Bender on the podcast recently, and I rely heavily on her work as well as yours in this area. So, I mean, I owe it all to you all really for paving the way for these ideas. But I ended up using the words boomer and doomer. Sometimes people say booster. Doomer is usually the one that people pick. But so the idea around tech boomerism is that, it's a camp of usually techno solutionists, people who see technology as this almost magical solution, often to very intractable problems like crime or whatever. And so the spy plane really kind of flew into Baltimore on that promise. And McNutt played into that idea that it can, quote unquote, solve otherwise unsolvable crimes. It can be a game changer for police. It can be a force multiplier for time-strapped investigators, that kind of thing. So that was like a lot of the, I guess, hype around the technology as it came into Baltimore. But what I saw then is that there would be a critique that rose up in the wake of that hype, which is doomerism. It's the sense that technologies are a kind of existential threat to humanity. And with the spy plane, that sounded like it's going to watch us all. It's going to invade our privacy.
All these things.
Big Brother is going to be watching my, poor daughter in the backyard in her bikini. That was literally something that someone said.
Yeah, good.
About it. To which McNutt would be like, "Are you kidding? Like, we have no interest in that." The ACLU played into this doomerist theme quite heavily as it critiqued the plane. They would say things like, "The spy plane is like police attaching a camera to every single Baltimorean as soon as they leave the house."
Wow.
Which is not really true. It's not that good. So part of the doomerist thing is your idea of hype, right? It's criticism that hypes up the technology. So what I noticed about that is that it became very difficult to actually have a clear-headed debate about this technology and what it actually does and what are its pros, what are its cons, and what should we do with it. And it became very difficult to have any kind of clear-headed conversation. And I think in that confusion, persistent surveillance systems and the BPD could just sort of roll in and implement. We weren't really able to have a good, clear debate about it before it was deployed.
Yeah, that's a nice example of the kind of problems we have in the context of this, gas, I guess. So one of the things another thing I really liked about your book is that your first kind of body chapter is you look at a case of success in which the system was used to track what you call a clever homicide suspect. So walk us through that a bit and what you saw and also kind of what that case kind of allowed you to pull out of what you were seeing.
Yeah. Would it be useful for me to explain a bit about how the technology works?
Yeah, probably. That probably would be helpful. Yeah.
May be helpful. So the technology is basically a big camera system. And it's an array, a camera array of very high powered, they're 192 megapixel cameras. They're sort of put together into this camera array. and they sit inside a completely unremarkable Cessna airplane. So it's not a drone. It doesn't look sophisticated. And I think a lot of people expected it to look a little more high tech than it does. But it is really just a gigantic camera system. And that system points out the side of an airplane. And the airplane flies in an orbit around, about a 30 square mile radius. And it takes one photo every second. So click, click, click. Those photos are then downlinked in real time to an operations center. And they use this special software that persistent surveillance systems developed. It's called iView. And it stitches those photos together into a kind of like film, but it's not really, full motion video. It's more like a flip book in a way. So as the images are refreshing second by second, you can start to pick out moving things on the ground. And the imagery is so high resolution, you can kind of zoom in to about the neighborhood level, and you can see people walking on the ground, cars driving, and kind of observe everyday life in a way. So the idea is if you point this thing at the city, it's going to capture, and you're recording all the time, it's going to capture crimes that you didn't know were going to happen. And then it gives you this almost kind of time machine-like capability. You can go back in time, quote unquote, and see where the person that eventually ended up at the homicide scene came from. You could potentially find out, fast forwarding in time, where they ended up at the end of the day, send police there. So that's the idea behind it.
And what does it look like? I mean, does it look like when you're looking into it, does it just look like a series of still shots, or does the system like reconstruct it as 3D or what? I mean, what's the actual like viewing? Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like satellite footage, I would say would be the closest thing. And if you don't know at all what you're looking at, you might think it's like an X-ray from a hospital or something. Like it's very grainy and kind of gray tones. They do have color cameras, but oftentimes you can't really see the coloring very well on the ground. So spy plane analysts become extremely talented at understanding what the heck this fuzzy smudge is that's moving along the ground.
Got it.
Can tell you what it is. But the untrained eye, you often don't know, or you wouldn't know.
That is very helpful. Thank you for doing that. So you start off with a case of success, right? I mean, so they found the bad guy. So yeah, go through that case a little bit for us, and pull out what you thought it allowed you to see about things.
Yeah, well, I wanted to concede the fact that the spy plane did work sometimes, quote unquote work. It solved otherwise unsolvable crimes. So it's not like it's junk at all. And so I wanted to walk readers through an instance in which it was working as advertised. This was the thing that was pitched to police, and it's doing the thing. So I call it in the book the Carroll Avenue case, which is not its real name. That's a pseudonym. But police refer to homicides by the street on which they happened, typically. So I carry that convention. So the Carroll Avenue case, the details of the case are this. Basically, someone comes into what they call in Baltimore a carryout. It's like a convenience store, but you can buy like sandwiches and stuff like that. This is in West Baltimore, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood in Baltimore. He comes into this carryout, shoots someone, runs out. And so there is some CCTV footage and security cam footage of the actual incident. But typically in a situation like this, when a suspect leaves the scene and they go out of the frame of a CCTV camera or a security camera, that's kind of it. You need to reconstruct everything from there based on testimony or whatever. So in this case, the spy plane was in the sky. It happened in the middle of the day. And they were then able to find the location and track the suspect out of the carryout. And so they tracked him both forward and backward in time for quite a few hours. And importantly, what happens is as the suspect is being tracked by the spy plane, he or she's also passing other CCTV cameras in the city. And Baltimore has hundreds at this point, thousands of these. There's also private security cameras, Ring doorbell cameras, cameras on ATMs, they're all over the place. So one of the things that the spy plane promised it could do is track people to other technology that's already in the city. So when he goes by a CCTV camera at a gas station, you could pick the exact second because the spy plane has a clock on every single photo they take. And you can pull up that footage very easily and then get more details on the suspect, what he was wearing, potentially a facial shot. So what happened in this case is they, after quite a long time, tracked him to a gas station where he was filling up, this is before the time of the murder, filling up the tires on his vehicle. And those tire pumps have a camera on them, quite high resolution. So they were able to pull that footage, get a facial scan of the guy, a facial shot of the guy. They then sent that information to an FBI task force that has facial recognition technology, and they were able to get a hit off of some sort of facial database. I don't know which one.
Wow.
It turned out that they kind of knew who the guy was and already knew some of his patterns of movement. So they were able to find him relatively easily and arrest him. And, you know, the police were stoked. I mean, they were
big win.
They came into the operations center and made a big show out of it and said, like, hey, we want to thank you guys. We never would have gotten this suspect if it hadn't been for you. There were a couple of other glitches in the case that they helped them work around. The suspect burned the car at one point, and they were still able to pick up the trail through persistent analysis, basically. So it was a huge moment for the program, and showed that it could, quote unquote, work as advertised.
And you contrast this with the next chapter is about a case of like false positive or mistaken identity. And, you know, it's funny. I just watched the film Coded Bias last night for the first time because we're using it. We showed it at a public event here at Virginia Tech, and we're using it at a class I'm teaching semester. And it was better than I thought it was going to be. I mean, there was, you know, it's one of those kind of, it's not as bad as The Social Dilemma, which was always my fear.
Yes.
And so there's a couple of things that were like
So bad.
overstated and annoying about it, but I thought it was in general was quite good. And I think the one of the consistent themes through Coded Bias is the worry of false positives. And you saw that in spades. So can you also play out that case for us and, you know, what the fallout was from that?
Yeah, so this case, which I call the McHenry Street case, again, which is a pseudonym, it follows right after I tell you about this thing where the technology is working so well. So the McHenry Street case is the exact opposite. So a false positive in the context of the spy plane is when analysts start tracking a person or car usually, and they think they have the right guy, but it turns out to be someone who is completely uninvolved. And this happened. We don't know how often it happened, but the McHenry Street case is probably the most high resolution example I can give you. So the way it played out was the details of the case are that a woman was shot in broad daylight in West Baltimore, and PSS was able to track some cars in and around the crime scene and identify what they thought was the getaway car of the person who shot this woman. And so, long story short, they have a really hard time tracking this car, in part because there's no other CCTV cameras in this particular neighborhood. They're just kind of going on spy plane footage alone. And what happens with this footage is a car will go into, like, let's say, the shadow of a building, and it will become very difficult to see it anymore. So what these analysts have to do is they have to constantly figure out when the car went in or behind an obstruction, like a set of trees with foliage or something, when it comes back out and into view from the obstruction, they have to ask themselves, is it still my car?
Right.
Or did I skip?
Yeah.
And when you can imagine, if you're watching this pixelated imagery with a line of traffic, you could very easily accidentally go to the car right behind or right in front of the one that you're tracking and not notice it. And that's exactly what happened in this case. So the analysts accidentally, quote unquote, jumped cars. That's a technical term that analysts would use. I jumped cars. Oh shit, I jumped cars would be a thing that people would say. And so they accidentally tracked this car, which they thought was the right one, all the way to a apartment complex in West Baltimore. And they phoned the detective and said, hey, I think he lives here. Go get him. And so the detective went, and he's knocking on doors. He's looking for the car. We have a description of the car from testimony at the scene, and it's nowhere. And he says to me, I spent about an hour, 45 minutes harassing people at this apartment complex, which was an interesting choice of words. I
Yeah.
think he kind of regretted using that phrase to me and later kind of walked it back. So I don't know what he meant exactly. And I wasn't there to see it.
Right.
But long story short, I mean, you could imagine this going spectacularly wrong in another instance. So what happens in this case is the analyst caught it, the mistake eventually, called the detective and said, "Hey, holy shit, we sent you to the wrong apartment complex. Back off, back off, back off."
Right.
So, Baltimore has a long history of police harassing people. It has been investigated by the state for this. So if this technology is contributing to that problem, that's a really big risk. And it's a risk that wasn't really discussed with the public. Nobody knew that a false positive was even possible. And we still don't know, because they didn't track it, how often this happened.
Interesting.
So this is, as far as I know, the only case that we know of that could be described in this way.
It's really interesting, man. And, you've already kind of gotten about, when we were doing the boomer doomer thing, you've already gotten into how, reception and response from various members of the community is complicated because there's people all over the map on things. But it also is true that you saw like pretty considerable buy-in from the citizens of West Baltimore to this
Yeah.
thing. And so how did you understand that? Because I mean, in a chapter before you get into the reception, you talk about how there's this, I mean, you just said there's a long history of Baltimore policing being problematic. There's also a long history of them kind of experimenting with different technologies. And yet, you see this kind of buy-in from the citizens of this very Black community. So how did you understand that
Yeah.
that buy-in?
Yeah, I was flummoxed by this for years, I would say. And I guess I suppose I could have just sort of put that off as a separate issue. But I got to know many people in West Baltimore who were backers of the spy plane. And I wanted to know, like, why, like, what is driving your faith, your belief? And a lot of it came from a sense of having no other options is part of it.
Yeah.
That we never get invested in. Our neighborhoods never get invested in. In fact, they get divested, if anything. So if there is a technology that could solve otherwise unsolvable crimes, even if it's an experimental one, like, yeah, I want to try it out.
Yeah.
We never get a chance to do this kind of thing in Baltimore. So there's that level of, which is a kind of boomerism in a way, but it's a boomerism of those who really have a stake in the technology solving
driven by desperation.
Very important problem.
Yeah.
Totally. But there was actually more nuance to it than just that. Part of the other promise that McNutt and others made was that the spy plane could watch police. And so it does have the capacity to do this. And there have been some cases in which persistent surveillance systems has provided evidence to a defendant who's been accused of something by police, falsely accused. So McNutt hosted these listening sessions, these kind of like chats with folks in West Baltimore for years before the spy plane actually came into town in 2020. And he would give them this pitch, this very kind of like techno-solutionist, boomerist pitch about all the things that the plane can do to solve crime. And then he discovered they were also interested in investigating police. And I think that brought a lot of people on board who otherwise would have been like, I don't know about this big brothery thing. But if you say it could watch police too, and so the line became, like we could control this technology a little bit. Like the community could be part of the investment instead of just being the target. So that really got a lot of people on board. They then went out and advocated for the spy plane with the mayor and the police chief, the governor, and it worked, more or less worked.
It's really nice. Something I've been kind of tracking for the last couple of years is like, there's, after the kind of George Floyd moment and like the phrase defund the police, I've noticed two things about the same time. One was older black politician from one of the Carolinas. I think it was maybe South Carolina in the wake of 2020, the 2020 election, saying defund the police is like a loser with my people
Yeah.
as a phrase.
Yeah.
And in about the same time, I saw a survey which showed that like black people, most black people actually wanted more policing at the
Yeah.
same time, And, I think it's very complicated in the way that you spelled out, but I really felt like I'd been kind of primed to find like good stuff on this topic. And I thought your chapter was a really wonderful kind of working out of these themes of showing like very complicated notions of police and society in these historically black neighborhoods. So thank you
Yeah.
for that.
Well, I mean, I think what I would want people to know is that attitude toward policing gets boiled down to the line, do you want more or less?
Yeah.
It's much more complicated than that.
Right.
I mean, I think ultimately what predominantly black neighborhoods want is better policing, the
Right.
kind of policing that white neighborhoods get, which actually does create a sense of security and actually is a kind of community service. So if you could give us that type of policing, we'd take it. That'd be great. But we just never seem to get it. So I think in part the spy plane was building on that promise that it's going to deliver a kind of precision policing that's high tech, the kind that we really would like to have if you could give it to us. And, as I try to show in the book, it did not pan out that way for them. And there was a lot of hurt feelings, I think, at the end.
That's interesting. And you show it kind of fell apart in at least two. I mean, it fell apart in a bunch of ways, but it fell apart in two major ways. And so the first is that it was found to violate the Fourth Amendment. And the second is, well, let's deal with that one first, because there's another
it's a big
conversation.
Topic.
Yeah, let's deal with that, and we can. Yeah.
So yes, the spy plane was deemed unconstitutional by a federal court, by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And there's a somewhat longer version of this story and a somewhat shorter version. So, I'm happy to go either direction. But
no, go for it, dude. We've got nothing but time.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, there in 2018, there was a Supreme Court decision called Carpenter versus United States. That Supreme Court decision is absolute hinge point in the way legal theorists think about the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment is your right to privacy. So in this decision, which has come to be called the Carpenter decision, the justices said that American citizens have a right to privacy in, quote, the whole of their movements. So that means that when the police track you for an extended period of time, each one of those views of your movements might be totally constitutional. But when you add them together, it creates this portrait or pattern of movement, and that is unconstitutional.
Fascinating.
The idea being that no one would expect that the police could sort of understand where you're going day after day, hour after hour. We just wouldn't expect that. That would be an unreasonable type of a search, these justices were saying. And that is not how the Fourth Amendment has been interpreted before. And in part, it's been pushed by technologies like our phones that can track us this way. So what ended up happening is the spy plane ran right into the face of that decision. It can, at least theoretically, track the whole of your movements for hours at a time. And it's not just like the ping of a cell phone, it's like actual photography of you. And so the question arose whether this plane is violating the Fourth Amendment in this new interpretation. And the ACLU and a coalition of racial justice activists came together and sued the Baltimore Police Department over this. And so that court case, which came to be called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle versus Baltimore Police Department, went to the district level. They lost the case there and then was appealed up to the Fourth Circuit level. And the Fourth Circuit agreed that and overturned a lower decision to say that indeed the spy plane reveals intimate details about people's pattern of movement that the police should not be allowed to have. And therefore, it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So what was interesting about my access is that I got to sort of see how the company dealt with this ongoing question about whether the plane should track people longer or shorter. Like, we don't want to violate this new Fourth Amendment decision. On the other hand, we could just keep tracking if we wanted. And so they made this really bizarre and I think interesting decision, which they called it the quote unquote 4-day rule. And they said that spy plane analysts can track anybody 4 days in time and no more. And that came from interpreting some of the language that these Supreme Court justices were using in the Carpenter decision. So they're literally reading the lines from the Supreme Court decision and
some lawyers
implementing, right? So it was really fascinating to see this like ostensibly theoretical discussion come to ground in an actual case.
Yeah.
So the 4-day rule aside, it really didn't work, didn't prevent the thing from becoming unconstitutional. And that ended up kind of tanking pretty much every investigation when it went into the court system. All the cases were thrown out.
That is wild, man.
Of this technology.
That's where I was going next. And I wanted to talk about the courtroom evidence side of the falling apart, but just kind of set that up. You and I recently had a kind of exchange on Twitter. I just still call it Twitter.
I still call it Twitter. Yeah, I can't do it, man.
I can't do it. But I was commenting on. I've been like closely following like organizational adoption of generative AI systems and what they are and aren't doing for people. And you rightly point out that I think productivity is important in terms of quality of life and kind of global change over the last 150 years. It also, we know this, can flatten things in all kinds of ways. So I was commenting on there was a police force experimenting with using generative AI for note taking.
Right.
And, and it was pointing out, unsurprisingly, because that's just what we keep finding over and over again, is that it just didn't help that much, right? It just doesn't speed things up that much.
Right?
Yeah, shocker. I think it's almost going to become established fact, I think, when it comes to the tech side of this thing. But your point is that, like, well, let's also think about, like, whether this is going to hold up in court, which is a really important question when we're dealing with, like, this police stuff. So I just thought that was like a really nice kind of big theme to explore. And then you have this chapter about how things fall apart. So, I mean, great. You've got this new hot technology that you can tell all these boomer stories about. But then, like, when the rubber meets the road, like, it really depends on whether it can stand up as evidence. Yeah. Tell us about like why it didn't and why it kept getting thrown out.
Yeah. I mean, so the boomer line would be, we're going to take this video evidence. It's going to show the quote unquote capital T truth of a crime scene. We're going to put it in front of a jury and they're going to interpret it the same way the police did, as the capital T truth. And that will just clear everything up. Brush our hands, case closed. And it's this really naive understanding of how technology works in court, the relationship between lawyers and judges and jurors. There's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah.
So part of what I did is I started digging into the history of video technology and imagery inside courtrooms. And what I found is quite shocking to me, which is that really the court system has never come up with a good way of dealing with video evidence.
Interesting.
Like, are we supposed to see it as like testimony? Which is always biased, right? Like you go to ask somebody on the street, what did you see? They'll tell you what they saw, but we always have a kind of hesitation about whether that's a partial view. So should we treat it like that? Or do we treat it like hard data, raw data, which we would see as like totally objective and not an interpretation at all? And there isn't really a good, I guess, way to deal with this in legal jurisprudence, which I was shocked. So the spy plane essentially has that same problem inside of it. The imagery is in fact harder to interpret than like body cam footage or something like that. It's very grainy.
Right.
And so police, jurors, they're all, looking at this thing and saying, well, what do you think it tells you?
Yeah.
What's the truth of the matter? And do I believe you? So a lot of what I think it hinges on is trust. Do people trust the systems that produce, the organizational systems that produce this imagery, interpreted it, and put it into a court system? And the answer in Baltimore is almost always no. The court system is so deeply broken in Baltimore that most juries really, I think, do not believe a lot of what police say. And so when it came time for this system to be put into an actual court proceeding, I was quite interested to know, like, would it hold up? And all along the way, nothing ever went to trial so far that I could really see it. But all along the way, what I saw was people basically saying, well, the imagery doesn't show what you say it shows.
Wow.
And there would be a kind of debate about what it actually shows.
Yeah.
So I don't really see any kind of like capital T truth coming out of the kind of magic of having the camera in the sky. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, that's a problem, right?
That's a big problem. Well, and it kills the efficiency argument too. Like you started with
Absolutely.
oh, it's going to be cheaper than having more detectives, but it's like if it doesn't hold up, I mean, what's the point, right?
Yeah, and I mean the concrete impact of this is that suspects who were arrested with spy plane investigations involved sat for years, sometimes 4 years in a jail cell waiting for lawyers to figure out what to do. So especially once the system was deemed unconstitutional, they had to figure out, well, can we hide the spy plane footage? Can we take it out of the investigation? Or does it corrupt the entire thing? And essentially what happened was the prosecutor's office determined there's no way we can prosecute these cases.
Jesus.
Even if we didn't use the footage in the investigation, just the fact that the spy plane was called is a big opening for any defense attorney to say, you violated the constitutional rights of my client.
Lord Almighty.
And so all of these cases got thrown out, including cases where, the folks who were involved said, like, you got the right guy, put him in prison. He killed my daughter. And
Jesus.
So police officers had to go back and say, look, we can't put the case on. It's not going to fly. It's not going to fly in court. And these were horrible, horrible moments for these families.
Yeah, that's just awful.
The person who they know, in their hearts killed their loved one is now back out on the street. So it was horrible for people who got arrested. It was horrible for people who got affected by the violence. And a lot of people suffered in the end because of that.
So tell us a bit about the kind of fallout from the failure of this. Tell us, both about the kind of hard feelings of the community, but also, like where's the company at now and where's the technology at?
Yeah, I think there's still some slice of the West Baltimore public in particular that would like to see the spy plane come back. And one of the ways that Ross McNutt and others in the company have thought about going forward with the technology, given that it's unconstitutional, at least in the state of Maryland, you really can't give it to police at this point. It's just not going to work out. There's a couple ways you could do it, but they're wonky. So one of the things that McNutt and others have thought about is, well, can we just fly the plane as a purely private enterprise and gather this evidence and give it straight to community members? So say you're a mother of a homicide victim, you want to know what happened to your son. Along comes persistent surveillance systems to say, hey, we have some footage of that day. Do you want us to look around and see if we can find anything? And then we can give you the footage and you can take it to the detective. So I think it's a question whether that's legal or illegal, or like there aren't really regulations around this kind of thing. But there are other companies that are experimenting with this kind of thing.
And what's the business model? It was like the citizens would pay for access, or?
So this is where it gets quite interesting. There's a system that many cities have where if you call in on a tip line for a particular homicide investigation, you'll get a little bit of money from the state.
Okay.
So McNutt's idea was to actually have the spy plane give tips to this tip line, and they could actually get money from the state. As a reward for contributing to these open investigations.
Holy shit, man. That sounds like a Cory Doctorow sci-fi novel or something.
Yeah, that money would be enough to probably fund it for free. Yeah.
Okay.
To citizens would be the idea.
Wild world. What a wild world.
Wild, huh?
Yeah, and is it like, so I think you already, I mean, is there anything else you want to say about the kind of fallout in the community? You say there's some people want it back. Some people were really hurt about its failure. Is there anything else that isn't in that picture yet?
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, I think. I think right now the odds of it coming back to Baltimore are very, very, very low.
Yeah.
And if it did, there would need to be full and total community control, which would also involve a much more robust look into police behavior. And to his credit, McNutt is game.
Yeah.
He's like, you want me to track every police vehicle all day long? I would love to do that. I would love to do that.
Your last chapter is called No to Hype, Yes to Community Control. So this is where your thinking kind of goes, is that this is what you'd need around a technology like this. And that makes sense. I mean, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about why there was community buy-in in the first place. It's just like, yeah, we care about violent crime. We also have this long history of violence from police and problems with police. So it becomes a kind of symmetrical technology that allows kind of both sides of it to happen.
Yeah, at least in theory, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if we're going to deploy experimental technologies like this, and that's a big if,
right?
Because
totally.
I don't know that they actually work very well.
Yeah.
But if we're going to do it, it needs to be in a way that the community has buy-in and control. They can pull the plug when we see that it's, for example, resulting in false positives that are destroying families. We really need a way to pull the plug on that. And it shouldn't be the case that police can kind of just tinker with these things in this experimental fashion without any oversight or input from the community. That's completely inappropriate. So I'm all for that. Like, if we're going to do things like this, that's a big if. I just think it needs to be built around communities and their needs.
Nice. That's great, man. And so this book it's coming out. We're recording on October 9th. This episode won't be out for a while, but your book's dropping like now, right?
Pretty soon, yeah. End of the month, yeah.
And do you know what the next thing is? And it's fine. I always tell people it's totally fine to say no. I'm like, take a break. I just got a book coming out. That's good. I support that in all kinds of ways. But yeah, are you like, are there got anything in the irons in the fire right now?
Well, I'm doing a bunch of public events.
Good.
And one that I'm very, very excited about, I'm doing a book talk at this like super hard lefty commie bookstore in Baltimore called Red Emma's. It's like one of my favorite places on earth. So I'll be there. I think it's December 10th. In conversation with a local journalist, Brandon Soderberg, who helped me a lot with the research for this book. So Brandon and I are going to have a conversation. I'm going to maybe read something from the book. And hopefully people will show up who have real questions about the plane and how it worked and what happened. A lot of this stuff has not made it into the public. So my hope is that the book will kind of be an excuse to get in front of people and have a public chat.
That's great, man. That's really good.
Hopefully stimulate ideas about how we could do this better or at the very least ward off disasters like this in the future. I think it's important for Baltimoreans to do that.
Well, Ben, this was so fun, and it's a wonderful book, wonderfully written book. So I tell listeners that if they just want a really nicely written technology studies book, this is a good one to check out. So thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate it, Lee.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.